Today is a continuation of this lens review here, the 85mm F2 IS Macro STM lens. And last week, I reviewed this lens in terms of its build quality, in terms of IS, and in terms of macro. Today, we'll look at handling, AF, and image quality itself. And of course, some of my final thoughts on should you get this lens, especially if you own the RF system. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions. This is of course the newest 85mm lens, the 85mm F2 for the RF mount. Before I start, I'd like to thank SLR Revolution for loaning me this copy of the lens, because without them, I will not be able to bring you this particular review itself. This is a continuation review and I highly recommend you look at the last review before continuing on with this video, because I will not be covering the same thing I covered last time, which is mainly the build quality, IS, and a little bit on its macro function, and of course the image quality, especially for night. And then in that video you will see a very good example of CA, while in this video I'll just show you the real world image performance and a little bit of highlight of the CA itself, especially how does it show itself in real world photos. Now before I start this review formally, let's take a look at this short little video, because I did a photo shoot with Ryuki and I recorded some short video with her. So today I have Ryuki here and today we'll be testing out this lens here. This is the 85 F2 macro lens, and today we'll have a photo shoot outside and then we'll see what the results are like. So stay tuned for the photos and then we will do a full review at the studio later. And that's about it for today's review. We'll go back to the studio and review the photos. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Welcome back to the studios. So I did a short shoot with Ryuki, as you can see in the video, and let me show you some of the photos from the photo shoot itself. Overall, I think this 85mm performance is really nice, but no, before me diving into the final thoughts, let's go step by step. Firstly, handling, followed by autofocus, and finally image quality, and then my final thoughts itself. So for handling itself, I would say this is a very nice lens to handle. It is not very heavy, it is not very long. The weight itself is quite balanced. As you can see, I'm holding with one hand for the entire review. I don't find much strain on my wrist. So this is a perfect setup if you want a light, small, and really relatively good setup for the RF system for Portraiture itself. Now, there's also one more advantage of having a light setup like this, is that you can use your left hand to direct your models. That is very important because voice is easily distorted in public, while pointing to the direction is always easier. And pointing with voice itself will make most instructions a lot clearer. And if you ask me, this setup allows you to do that, while the 85mm 1.2 will not. Even if you compare to like the Tamron 85 1.8 with the adapter itself, will result in a front heavy setup, which is a lot harder to do and a lot harder to hold on prolonged periods compared to this setup itself. So overall, if you ask me in terms of handling, this is a win. The only thing I don't like about this is that the shaky barrel that I highlighted in my last review, if I'm not doing any photo shoot and I do focus on my camera on the hand itself, you can't really feel that shakiness in the barrel. Doesn't affect image quality, as you can see in my image section, but overall, just a little bit disturbing if you ask me. So when it comes to autofocus, I would say the autofocus performance of this lens is pretty good. In my last review, I talked about its macro capabilities, and you know the autofocus from macro to infinity is quite long. But in the field itself, you can see in this video, from infinity to your subject is pretty fast if you ask me. I have no complaints in the speed on general. I'll say it's not as fast as the 85mm 1.2, but definitely very, very decent in performance. And not only is it fast, it does work very well with the continuous AF on this camera. If you do spinning shots, you know that normally that requires pre-focus. If not, the chance of the camera catching up to the eye is not very good unless you're using some Sony camera, of course. With the R5 and this lens setup, you can easily take spinning shots, half-body spinning shots, and still get tech-sharp focus on the eye itself. It's not a challenge to do it. Probably like in 10 shots, I can get like 8 to 9 tech sharp and maybe one not so sharp shot, and maybe only one out of focus shots. And that is a very good performance for this 85mm lens here. There is only one thing I will say about the autofocus system of this 85mm lens, and that is the usage of the STM motor in this lens itself. Now, the STM motor seems to be taking a larger stepping than the USM, so when you use continuous AF with the R5, at times it's like it's trying to get in position, and because the stepping is a bit large, the camera is really trying to fine-tune this small little focus itself, and you can really feel the vibration of the lens in the field. And I also think that this vibration, or should I say the getting into position because of the larger stepping on the STM motor, does affect sharpness to a certain extent. You can see in the few shots here, they look sharp, but they are not the sharpest you can get. I can easily show you shots that are way sharper than them, or should I say significantly, notably sharper. However, if you ask me overall, at 100%, they just don't look like super tech sharp, but more than usable. And if you ask me, really from a larger point of view, 98% sharp shots is something you can get with this lens. However, if you are very, very critical, I'll say this lens will provide you 80% ultra tech sharp shots, while the next 18% is probably just slightly off, just really a slight softness in it. No big deal to your overall, photo experience, but that is something to note if you are the type that like to zoom in 200%. And lastly, we'll talk about image quality with the lens here. Now, this lens itself, I have tested in the last review, and I can tell you that this lens does have CA. It is relatively sharp, at least in my night shot. And I can tell you that in this day shot itself, it is true too. It is relatively sharp throughout the frame. Compared to the Tamron, this lens is as sharp as the Tamron in the center, a little bit sharper than Tamron on the left side, and a little bit softer than Tamron on the right side. And I can say that this is probably due to variation, because all lenses have some form of variations. And for this particular comparison itself, it just so happened that the Tamron and the 85mm RF here is the opposite of each other. One side being sharper than the other, and the other being softer than Tamron itself. So no big deal. Overall, I would say as this lens is generally very, very sharp across the entire frame. Now, of course, you can just autofocus on those points and get perfectly sharp shots there. And that is what happens in the field itself. Because in the field itself, as a F2 lens, you will not want to focus shift. What you will do is to shift your focus point, or maybe use eye detection focus to really shift the focusing point on the eye itself. And I can tell you that from my experience with shooting this lens in the field, I'll say it's nowhere in the frame do I find the image quality not good enough for my purpose itself. And if you have followed my blog so far, you should know that I use a lot of extremely sharp lenses, and this 85mm f2 do not disappoint me anywhere in the frame for portraiture. In fact, if you ask me, if you have seen my previous Tamron review, this lens is better than the Tamron in this aspect, because the Tamron did produce me slightly hazy shot when compared to the f1.2 85mm. While this 85mm f2 compared to the 85mm 1.2, as you can see in this shot here, is very comparable. For them are as sharp as it gets. Of course, the 85mm 1.2 looks a little bit sharper, but this performance is way better than what the Tamron could have done. And just to note, I did not use any hood on that 85mm. I also did not use any hood on this 85mm f2. So they are as good as it gets. There's no hood to protect it from hazing or anything, but I did notice that there is no difference between it and the 85mm 1.2 unless you're zooming to 200 or 300%, and you just see a slight smudge of more details on the 85mm 1.2 itself. Now, in terms of CA wise, if your model is wearing any form of sparkly or silvery jewelry, you have to take note, because I can show you this particular shot here. Ryuki was wearing a silvery, I would say as hairpin, and you can see a little bit of CA, this reddish purplish CA that I highlighted in my last video. It does represent itself quite easily when you're doing portrait shoot with your subject itself. So that is something to note really, because CA can really spoil your photo, because if the CA happens in certain conditions, it can be very hard to correct. And this is probably the biggest reason why you will ever want to buy the 85mm 1.2, because that lens have no CA, while this lens do suffer a little bit of this CA, especially in these silvery highlight regions. And lastly, for image quality, especially for a portrait lens, we'll talk about bokeh. Of course, if you compare to a 1.2 bokeh, there is no fight. The 1.2 is a lot more bokeh, a lot more smoother. But, if you just look at 85mm f2 itself, it looks pretty okay, if you ask me. There is no significant jittery points in the shot itself. Overall, most of the buildings, as you can see in the background, is quite smoothed out. And really, there is nothing much to complain about the bokeh. Now, there is, of course, one particular shot I show you here where the bokeh is going through some tree leaves, and you can see that it does form this cat eye bokeh look that can be a little bit, I would say, distracting. However, the only way to get a better bokeh there is to use the 85mm 1.2, because no other lens I have seen so far will fix that problem unless you are using the 85mm 1.2 or the 85mm 1.2 DS, which will perfectly fix that problem. But that lens, both of that lens cost 4 times more than this. So really, in terms of image quality, there is really nothing to complain of the 85mm f2 here. It works perfectly well as a portrait lens, and you will not be disappointed anywhere in the frame with this particular lens here and with the R5. Considering that the R5 is a 45 megapixel camera, this lens really resolves the camera sensor quite well, and I don't think there is anything to complain about, especially with a price of just 600 USD. So really, in the end of the day, my final thoughts of this lens, I think this is a very, very good lens. And if you are using the RF mount and you're not intending to use this lens on some other EF mount cameras, like if the RF mount is your only camera you have, you should buy this lens. You should not buy the Tamron, you should not buy the Sigma, because this lens on the RF mount, on the RF camera, performs, if you ask me, similar in image quality, but better in everything else. It has a better autofocus. It does have a IS system. It does give you macro. I mean, considering the price of 600 USD, you are getting a lot more bang for your buck with this lens, with very similar image quality compared to the Sigma 85mm 1.4 or the Tamron 85mm 1.8. The only advantage of those lenses is their build quality is a lot better. There is no like this shaky barrel problem. And not only that, they can be adapted on any other EF mount cameras, which, if you're using any Cine camera or you're using Sony cameras, you may want the adaptability. However, considering that those lenses weigh so much more, this is only 500 grams and all the other lenses weigh more than this lens, you may think that maybe, getting a native RF mount may be a lot better in terms of the choice itself. And not only that, we don't need an adapter, so this lens is relatively small and compact. As such, really, from my opinion, if you need an 85mm, you're only using for the RF mount camera and you do not want to buy the 85 1.2 for whatever reason, this is your best choice, really, best choice. That is my opinion, coming from somebody who done so much portraiture and used so many lenses itself. But there is probably one more question that you may ask me. Am I going to buy this lens? I will say as no. Why? It's because I own the 85mm 1.2 and the 85mm 1.2 is a superior lens. It is sharper and it has more bokeh. It is a lot faster. The AF system is a little bit more responsive. And overall, the only bad thing about that lens, or should I say two bad things about the lens, is the weight and the price. It is a lot heavier, more than twice the weight of this lens, and it is very, very costly, easily 3 to 4 times depending on where you are in the world. However, there is one thing that this lens can do and the 85 1.2 cannot, and that is macro. However, I'm not a macro photographer, so I don't really care about the macro capabilities. As such, I will not be getting this lens. And if I want macro, I will probably get the 100mm f2.8 lens, because that will give me true macro, while this gives me like 0.5. And I have to say that this lens will be returned to my retailer as such, because I don't really find a need for it. However, my opinion still holds that if you want an 85mm lens and you do not want to buy the 85mm 1.2 for whatever reason, the 85mm F2 Macro IS STM lens by Canon is the lens of choice. And really, this beats any other adapted lens I have tested so far, at least for the 85mm range. And this pretty much sums up my review here. I hope you enjoyed this short little review, even though there's 2 parts, but I think it is a lot faster to break it up and a lot easier also to convey the results to you guys. Once again, if you have not seen my last review, I would recommend you to see it again before coming to a conclusion yourself. But if not, this is the recommended lens of choice if you're not going to buy the 85mm 1.2. And that's about it for today's review. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.